Hello and welcome to part 2 of the fur tutorial. Right, last time we added the actual grooming part, we added the actual systems, and now we're actually going to be looking at the geometry node setups. Right, we're going to be adding those, and we're going to give each and every layer of hairs that we created its own geometry node setup to make them look like they have their own little system. Right, and of course we're going to make them blend together and make them look more realistic. So let's dive into it. Right, so let's make it work first by adding a little bit of a variation here in this area. This is all going straight down, that's not what I like. So let's go to the solid view, sculpt mode, and let's just draw a little bit of an kind of a curve in there. Right, so there's some random rotation of the hairs there. Beautiful. Now I'm going to go to the second hair system, and let's see. I'm gonna go to sculpt mode, and I'm gonna get the snake hook and drag some of these longer hairs on the front out with the sphere mode. Here we go. That's looking better. Alright, so just so we get more of that transition going. And now we also need to go to that face part, go to sculpt mode, and transition some of these shorter hairs there as well. Right, so this is all going to go down there. This is going to intersect and become longer at the bottom. And we should probably have used the project brush there. Reason why is because the sphere brush will only grab the, for example, this part, and then in a sphere radius from it, it will move the hairs with it. But with projected, it will move everything from front to back pretty much. Right, so let's just do it with that. So make this a little bit longer. Just like that. Beautiful. Beautiful, 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 beautiful. Right, something like that. Looks quite nice. And let's crank this up a little bit too. Make it nice and intersect. And let's go back to the comb brush and move some of these hairs out a bit more. Something like that. So it's more random and more beautiful. Right, something like that. That looks like quite a nice intersection. Quite a nice transition, a nice flow. And I'm gonna go back to object mode. And now we're gonna start working on some of those geometry nodes. Right, so I'm gonna drag this to the left and set the right window to geometry nodes editor. And now we have our deform curves on surface node, and that is usually what comes with adding the curves onto your surface, right? Because it is deforming curves on a surface, the surface being this little sphere, right? If we move the sphere, everything will move with it as well. So that is something all of these systems have, and let's rename the long hairs. Let's call it the mains. Here we go. Alright, so we can even order these by setting a little 1 point in front of it. So they are nicely in order. Beautiful. And now we can start tweaking this, right? And I'm gonna swipe this little window to the bottom and set this to the asset browser. And I'm gonna set this to the essentials and then hair. Right, so this is all the hair that comes with the Blender. They included it in, I think, 3.5, and it works incredible. So we're going to be using a lot of these to actually tweak our system. Right, so let's see. I'm going to move that up and move this a bit to the right. There we go. So we have a bit more space to work with. There we go. Right, so we don't really need geometry nodes themselves. We're not going to be tweaking them all that much, but we will be tweaking them just a little bit at some point. Alright, so first things first, let's add a little bit of a curve radius. Let's go to the rendered view, and I prefer starting off with a clean plate, which means that the best way to see what your system looks like is by already having the correct radius of your hairs. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my set curve hair profile and just drag that onto our system on the top, for example. So now if we go to the base hairs and to the modifier panel, you'll see, and I dragged it onto the top and side hair instead, you can see that we now have a new node there that says set hair curve profile, right? So that is nice. So that already gives us a new radius of the hair. It's already a little bit thinner. So we can now set this to a value we like, for example, 0.003. Right, so that is nice and thin hair. That is something we can work with for sure. Now for the face hairs, we want to do the same thing. And I'm not gonna use the same geometry node system. So I'm not just gonna use this one. I'm gonna drag in a new one. Reason why is because I want, why is it not on there? Did I drag it on the wrong one? Maybe I did. Let's drag it on the face hairs. Here we go. Beautiful. So now I want these hairs to be a little bit thicker already. So the reason why is because even though they may be the same thickness in real life, I'm gonna add a little bit of thickness to those hairs because it will look a bit more natural. And that way we won't have to fill up the entire face with more and more hairs. We can just crank the thickness up a little bit and it will still look quite natural. Right, so I'm gonna set this radius to about 0.005, right? And it should still look quite decent, right? You can see maybe they are a little bit thick, but we can take a look at that later, okay? So make sure that, well, you have the render engine set that you want to use. I use cycles. I have it set on CPU, that's not the right way. GPU is much quicker. And now we only have the beard, the neck, the manes left. So drag your curve profile on there as well. And let's set this to 0.003 as well, right? Because those are long hairs and this looks fine, right? We can even crank that down later. Maybe we should already 0.002, just a little bit because they are long hairs, right? Something like this. So now we can start working with all of these assets and see how we can achieve the best result that we can, right? So first things first, for the face hairs, we still see some skin through it. So we need some extra hairs. So I'm just gonna add a duplicate hairs there. Let's see where it is. Duplicate. I always struggle to find the right ones. There it is. Just drag that one on. And you can see initially we get 10 hairs for each hair we already have in there. Right, so this already is going to depend a little bit on what your system can handle. Right, my system is quite powerful, it has no issues with 10 whatsoever, but you can also set this to 3, it should still be quite filling up the face, but I'm gonna leave this at 10 for now, and we can even crank it up later if we really want that. Okay, so what I see initially is that at those side parts we don't really have a smooth transition, so I'm gonna go back to solid view. I'm going to select my face hairs, go to sculpt mode, and I'm going to just snake hook out some of those hairs on the sides and set that to sphere as well. Let's disable the duplicate hairs for a sec, and let's just drag this out a little bit and make sure that your mouse is nice and on the sides, so you don't drag all of it out, just some of these end points, right? Just like this. Same for the other side, drag it out a little bit. Here we go. Create those nice transitions that you're looking for. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And remember that every hair you now drag out is going to have 10 children hairs in that geometry node system that we just added. Right, so don't add too many there. Something like this is already quite decent in my opinion. Here we go. There as well a little bit, because there we also have quite a hard transition. Here we go. All right, that looks quite nice. There as well a little bit. Here too, and there too. Right, I think that should be fine. So let's go back to front view and object mode, and let's see it with the duplicate hairs on. Right, so already we have much more of an actual kind of transition between those hairs, and we can still sculpt them later, don't worry. Right, so now I just want to take a look at those those top hairs and the side hairs, because there's not a lot that we really need to change there in the center, because the hair doesn't really have much room and much length to really do something. It can't really clump together, it can't really curl. All it can do is pretty much stick out, just like you can't really shape a buzz cut, right? You can just have it, but you can't really shape it, you can't really move it back, you can't curl it, whatever. So we don't really have to shape that any way, shape or form. Let's go to the top part instead, right? So what do we want to add there? Well, for starters, I usually want to add some kind of a noise profile, right? So I will start with adding some hair curve noise, drag that on top of the hair there. And I think I added it to the base hairs. Yes, I did. Let's drag it to the outer hairs. There we go. Right, so now we can control the actual noise there. And there is some different values that we can actually work with. So what we usually try to do is work with the factor, so how strongly this affects our hair. And you can see 0 is basically straight, 1 is going to be noisy, and the distance from how much they move away from the center as well, right? So I still want some kind of a flow in there, so I'm not going to crank up the distance too much. So something like this works fine. And then for the shape, this is pretty much where it starts to add the noise on the hair. 0.5 is halfway, 0.7 is going to be 0.7th of the way of the hair. And well, you can pretty much define where it starts having the noise. So the starting points of the hair, I don't want to add too much noise to. That's where the hair is the thickest, right? The hair is the thickest as where it comes right out of your skin. That is why some people think if you shave, your hairs become thicker. Well, actually, you just cut your hairs off at a thicker point and they will feel thicker, right? At least I think that's where it comes from. And then we can simply just crank up the scale if we want this to be stronger, right? For example, like this. And there we go. So we can also change the seat if you have a specific kind of part that you want to have more noise in. Sometimes this will change that and will perform that for you. Okay, so for the scale, let's see, maybe we want a little bit more. Here we go. And I think we can leave it at that for now. Right, so we have a little bit of noise going on, which looks quite beautiful, right? So we still want some more hairs there at the side as well. You can see that those parts on the sides are also quite dense, and first you can look right through them. So I'm gonna add another duplicate node on there, so duplicate hair curves. Here we go. And right away you can see we add a lot of new hair. So let's set this on 6 instead. And that looks quite good actually, right? Quite nice. And I think the top hairs is actually a little bit maybe too short. So how do we change that? Well, just select the hair and go back to sculpt mode and just drag that out a little bit more. Like this, for example. If you want this to be longer, I'm going to disable Y and just make this a bit more pointy, I guess. And maybe have some more randomness there. Beautiful. Alright, that should do the trick a bit more already. Okay, so next up, I want to look at what else we can do with this hair. It is still maybe a little bit static. So we can add another noise level right after the duplicate hair curves, right? So because right now the hairs that were there initially are just duplicated with the same kind of noise offset. But if we add another layer of noise, or let's do phrased actually, then all of those individual duplicated hairs are going to be phrased, right? So if we drag this on top, you can see that now each of those endpoint hairs are going to be phrased a little bit, right? So you can see it happening, and we can even crank up the distance so they become more random there at the endpoints, which may look just like you want. And the shape, same thing like I told you with the noise profile, right? Something like this looks quite nice if you ask me. So let's start working on this bottom layer, the manes of the cat, because right now it looks, well, off, right? So let's initially drag a duplicate hair curves on there. Beautiful. And let's start off with some noise as well. So drag your noise on there. And I think this noise can be a bit stronger because we have longer hair as well. Something like that. And I think the shape should be 0.5 around that, and the scale can be much stronger. Maybe something like that. Right? I think that looks much better already. So one thing we forgot to add at the top head, what we definitely need at this beard area, is the clumping, right? Clumping is very important in animals. Usually the hairs follow a bit more in the same direction for clumps, right? You can see that they actually clump together quite tightly, and it happens a lot in the wild as well. So this is an indoor cat. It doesn't get dirty, doesn't get wet. And if you have animals outside, hairs tend to clump even more together because you have dirt that makes it stick together. Hair becomes wet, dries up, it becomes sticky, and it will just stick together more. So that is how you, well, what you have to figure out. So there is a clump node, so clump hair curve, just drag that on top. And right away you can see that we get some clumping going on in those beard hairs. Now I think this clumping is too small. So how do we fix that? Well, there's a very easy way, and we need to look at the structure of the geometry nodes here. So we have a duplicate hair curves. If we disable that, we pretty much have the clumping that we want to have, right? They are quite big chunks, but if we enable this, then it's going to be clumping the duplicate hair curves instead. So I'm just going to move this in front of our duplicate hair profile, and then we have much more of an actual clumping of the initial hair. And then I'm going to add another clump hair curves right after, right? So now we get quite some strong looking clumping profiles, right? So if we disable that initial one, it still clumps, but it doesn't clump as hard as I would love it to be. All right, so that is pretty much how that works. So let's disable the last one and work with the first one first, because there is a lot of values that we can tweak. So the tip spread being one of them. If you want your tips to be a bit more spread apart, it literally just does what it says. All right, you can open it up a little bit. And you can also change the shape, right? So I want this to clump maybe a little bit earlier even. So 0.4. And I think the rest of this is pretty much fine. We can try to change the clump offset a little bit. Maybe so the hair goes slightly outwards. Let's see. Maybe just a little bit. There we go. And the distance fall off, we can even increase that if we want there to be less clumping the longer the hair gets. But let's look at our kitty. It doesn't really work that way. So right, so let's just keep it at 0. And the distance threshold, I think we can keep it 0 too. Yeah. So that is the first one. Let's re-enable the second one, right? Because that is really where the clumping gets crazy. And we want this to be quite strong like this, right? Keep a look at your reference image. You can see that the endpoints split a lot more than we have right now. So we can split those endpoints up a bit more. So tip spread, crank that a little bit up. There we go. And maybe the distance fall off a little bit as well. No, the clump offset, I guess. Just to make this a bit more randomized too. Something like that. That looks quite nice. And actually, I'm going to go to my duplicate hairs and maybe set this to a bit higher values. Maybe 12. There we go. And that looks quite decent. So let's just hide our first clumping for a second. See how it looks. Okay, that looks fine. And now for the final part, I'm gonna add at least some phrase in the end. Because, well, it still looks a little bit static for some of the points. So what I'm gonna do is just add a bit of phrase. And phrase usually just makes your endpoints of the hairs go a little bit crazy. Right, so let's just throw that on there. And let's see how it looks. Let's add a little bit of a distance, or not so much, but just a little bit. Just like that. Right, it's beautiful. And the shape, I guess we can set that at like 0.75. Nice, nice, nice. Right, so let's start actually adding an HDRI real quick, because the shadow here is throwing me off a little bit. So let's go to the world settings, environment texture, open, go to where you store all of your HDRIs, which is going to be in my download folder. And you can find it by typing in HDR. I'm guessing you can see this screen, so that's why I'm telling what I'm doing. And then I'm gonna drag in this one. That looks nice. And I'm gonna delete the initial light point. Let's set this to shader and world for a second. Go to home. If you can't find your nodes, you can press the home key and it will take you to your nodes. And I'm gonna select this, hit Ctrl T, and I'm gonna rotate this so we get some nice light values. Alright, something like this looks quite cool to me. Alright, so let's hide that background. So let's go to film in the render properties and let's just select transparent. So we don't get distracted by that background when we rotate our screen. Right? Beautiful. And you can see that the back of our head, the back of our kitty is bold. Alright, so that's fine. And yeah, let's start working more with this. So now we actually get a more accurate representation of what this looks like. Right, so something that I feel like is missing is a little bit of that high frequency kind of twisting, yeah, curling. It doesn't curl a lot, but you can see there's a slight kind of bending going on there. So how do we do that? Well, we just drag and drop, let's say, curl hair curves. There we go. So from the start, it's going to curl way too much. So let's go to the actual node tree there, and let's just tweak that to be very, very subtle, right? So that means that we have to crank down the factor, of course, right? So we want this to be quite low. quite mellow. And we want the frequency to be, let's say, something that looks right to us. Something like this, maybe. Let's see. Let's see how it looks. Looks a little bit better, but I think now it is a bit too chaotic. It looks nice though, but the kitty is quite groomed. So let's just start with the vector to be a little bit less even. So it's just a little bit of that hint of bending going on there. Something like this maybe. Right, so it is very low, but you can still see it happening right there. Right, so that looks quite alright. So let's say we want to add some color or we want to tweak some of these values. And the one thing that I really do want to add, by the way, is those pointy hairs that are sticking out of the head, right? So this is still, I'm guessing it's because it's a young cat, I'm not sure, but the hairs will still grow on the head, so these will grow as well. So maybe there's some hair that's already a bit longer, I guess. But that is what I want to recreate here too, because I kind of like it. So let's do that. It already has it a little bit, but not really those long ones. So how do we do that? Well, you may think that the trim curves is not the way to go, but I'm going to use that anyway, because the trim hairs is also going to allow us to make hairs longer, right? Quite nice. So let's drag and drop that on there. And right away you can see that it explodes, which is not what we want. So what we can do is just go to that geometry nodes tab. Let's select it. And let's just set the replace length to no. There we go. So now you can see that if we change the length vector, you can see that we can actually trim our hairs down so they become shorter. But we want them to become longer. So we should be able to set this higher to 1.2 for example, but we don't want this to happen with every single hair, but just with a selected bunch of them. And we can't really set that up in here, which is annoying. So the easiest way that I know how to do that is by going to the geometry nodes editor of this GeoNodes. And all that we have to do now is find the let's say the curves that are being used, right? So I'm going to go to the start. Usually when I can't figure out a geometry node right away, I will start from the start. We have a curve here that goes to the capture attribute, and it goes two ways, here and the bottom and here. So this is the scaling part. We don't really need to touch that. And the top part, this is for repositioning the points for trimmed curves, right? So this is the actual set position that controls our curve points, right? So I think we should just be able to select some of the curves that are being transformed by this trim hair curves instead of all of them, right? So if we drag this out and we set this to a random value, you can see that this already affects our hairs, and the probability means that, well, how much probability there is of a hair being selected. So if I set this all the way to 1, all of the hairs are going to be set to the length factor of 1.2, but if I set this to 0, none of them are. So if I just drag this up slightly, you can see that we get some of these sticky hairs. So if I set this to 1.4, we are even going to have more of those sticky hairs, just like I want it to be. Beautiful. And we can even control the random offset a little bit, right? So just to make none of them the exact same length, I'll make this 0.3, 0.2 maybe. 0.2, and we can set the probability to be just a little bit higher, and the length factor a little bit higher as well, maybe. Here we go. So now we have some actual hairs that are sticking out nicely of those sides. We actually get that nice little hairs, right? And I like it. Right, so I want the same kind of trim system set up for the face, because there's not a lot of interesting stuff going on in the short hairs. But I want to have some hairs that are actually maybe sticking out a little bit more, right? So to do that, I'm first going to make everything a bit shorter, I think, because it still looks maybe a bit long. So let's add our general trim hair curves on there. So let's go back to the asset browser. And let's head over to the trim hair. Where is it? Trim. This? No. Where is the trim hair curves? There. Drag and drop that on and disable this, and we can now just create a little bit of a random offset of like 0.6, right? So some of these hairs will be a bit shorter And we can even set the length to like 0.8 to make them all a little bit shorter. Right, so I think they do look a little bit thick right now. So let's go to that initial set her hair curve profile and set it to 0.003. Just so they look a little bit thinner there as well. Right, something like that already looks pretty much like I want it to be. Right, so that has been part 2. We did a lot of geometry node setups, a lot of tweaking of values, but in the end it looks a lot more realistic and I'm happy with the results. In part 3, we're going to be working on the actual texturing. Alright, so how do we grab or make an image texture and set that to be the texture for the hairs as well. Alright, so it's going to be transferred from the emitter object, the initial sphere that we added, onto the actual hair strands, right? And believe me, it is a little bit harder than we would like it to be. Okay, so if you like the video, please leave a like, a comment, or subscribe. Any one of those will make me incredibly happy, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!